In the olden days, we used to believe that the Earth was flat, and if a ship sailed out to the edge, they would simply fall off. We later learned through the voyages of Columbus and Magellan and other explorers that in fact the Earth is round, and we've used that now to navigate in many different parts of the world. And it's sort of a euphemism now for people that continue to do the same thing without taking information, new information, into account when they want to do something or plan something. And the title of this presentation is End Flat Earth Zoning on Johns Island, South Carolina, because in many respects, this mentality of flat map planning and zoning is still being used today in the City of Charleston Planning Office. This is a satellite map showing the Charleston area in the center. And what you see on the peninsula is this very bright white color that is highly reflective impervious surface area, surrounded by a red color, which is false color aero infrared film showing vegetation. So red is vegetation, white is development. You can very clearly see the development on James Island and West Ashley and pushing out into Johns Island as well. And you can also see the two rivers that were formed by the damming of the Santee River to flush more water down the Cooper River. So it's a large area, gives us an idea of the low country with the rivers running into the sea. This image was created in my lab for the Charleston Harbor project that basically is a dot density map where each dot is 50 people. So in 1990, Charleston was a very densely populated area surrounded with about 1 million acres of forested land. And this is a satellite image of Johns Island and Wadmalaw. And you can see that Johns Island is bounded by the estuaries on the south, Bohicket Creek on the right or to the west of the island, and by the Stono River on the eastern side. But if your eyes follow the Stono River, you'll see that it actually goes all the way around the island, connects into Wadmalaw Sound. This is a different kind of image of Johns Island. This is what's called a digital elevation map that was generated from a system called LIDAR, which is a range-gated laser used to map vegetation elevations and land elevations. This image was done in 2002 by NOAA. And what it very clearly shows is Johns Island is actually a series of dunes with swales in between that were formed over 100,000 years ago when sea level was higher during the Pleistocene days. And as sea level receded, the dunes were left behind. And it gives what I think is a really nice understanding about the low country. It sort of shows the seamless pathways through which water flows in and out of our island. If we superimpose developments, in other words, a Google Earth image on top of this digital elevation map, we can see very clearly that most of the developed areas are built along the tops of the dunes. The people that originally settled on Johns Island ran Maybank Highway down along a dune, and it connected to Wadmalaw and continued along that same dune that's transected by the Bohicket Creek. So what they did was they lived on the highlands and they farmed the lowlands. The city of Charleston began its annexing in the early part, I guess, in the latter part of the 1990s, and created the urban growth boundary, which would define areas within which there could be land that could be developed to higher population densities than in the county. And this is part of the city's annexation, which runs right along down the main causeway of Maybank Highway. If we take this image and we superimpose it on top of the digital elevation map, we can very clearly see that some of this land that's open for development is higher and some of it's lower. If we take a 2017 Google Earth image and superimpose it on top of the digital elevation map, it becomes apparent that many of the newer developments are being built in these lower areas. And not only are they being built in the lower areas, but they're bridging the lower areas and the higher areas. And when that happens, they're going to divert the flow of water from its natural course. So there are two issues here at stake. One is building without recognizing the three-dimensional topology or topography and the flow that water will take naturally is going to create flooding situations in some areas simply because the drainage is being blocked. But in other areas, if you build a development in a low-lying area, you may be setting that community up for a flooding experience that it doesn't necessarily want to ever have. For example, the land between the airport and Maybank Highway is very low. Some of it's below 8 feet elevation. I started a petition called Save River Road, Johns Island for More Development about a couple weeks ago in response to a rezoning proposal placed in front of City Council. This is to rezone some area that was once farmland, and now they want to rezone it from light industrial to rural residential, which would allow building approximately 3.5 homes per acre on about 100 acres of land. I started the petition, and within a week I had 1,600 signatures. I presented it to City Council. We now have 1,850 supporters have signed this petition. This is a pretty impressive response from this community. And this is one of the reasons that I started this little PowerPoint, because I realized that maybe there are people that would like to learn more about this and that will not meet me directly. So I'm going to put this up on YouTube for you to watch. So here goes. Here's the proposed site that at one time is called Oakville or Oakvale, but it happens to be on a very low piece of land next to the Johns Island Airport. And this is the last undeveloped estuarine creek on Johns Island. And notice how Burden Creek, which is at the edge, connects through almost all the way to Bohicket Creek. Probably was once connected, or maybe on extremely high tides or storm surge would become reconnected. Now, if you look at new developments, they're really engineered landscapes. Almost every development I've seen taking place on Johns Island, the developers go in and they've clear cut the landscape. They sell off the timber and the topsoil. They dig a deep pond, and they use that sand to provide building paths and to increase the lot elevation for flood regulations. They also use that sand to fill the riverfront lots to within a few feet of the marsh critical line. They protect the live oak trees on the property by building boxes around them to keep out this fill. And then essentially what happens is the entire area is essentially or functionally impervious surface area. The pavement, the buildings, and the sod, because the sod is placed on top of this virtually impermeable sandy clay building pad that's been built. The roads then often drain down to the marsh or directly into the river, and the storm drainage appears to run again into the river. And this is a very typical scenario. I want to walk you through one of these communities. Here's the pond that's been overdug to a deep depth. The sand was stockpiled, and then it was used to elevate building lots all the way down almost to the critical line. The newer lots have been filled a little bit higher than existing homes, which are part of the same development, creating a swale in between that I would imagine would be a pathway for water to flow. These lots are pretty low now, and you can see the impervious nature of the soil in that even a day or two or three after a rainstorm, these areas are still holding a lot of water. The grand trees are preserved by elevating the lots around them, but they build these little boxes. And what happens essentially is the trees are both drowned by too much water, and because they're surface feeding plants, the roots are smothered and compacted, and they have no place to go. So it's a great idea of essentially death by preservation. Now, this particular development I talked to you about is Stone Oak View, happens to be in this area right here, just north of Burden Creek. We have Burden Creek, and then we have Stone Oak Point, which is a community of about one house per 2 or 3 acres. And then we have this proposed rezoning effort right next to Airport Creek. all of these areas are relatively low. And one can imagine a scenario in which a storm comes ashore, a large hurricane pushing, say, 9 or 10 feet of storm surge that would bridge Bohicket Creek and the Stono River. And these areas would be flooded. Hurricane Matthew came to Charleston last year, 2016, and pushed about a 9.3 foot tide through the Charleston Peninsula, which ended up flooding a major part of downtown. Burden Creek Road on Johns Island the morning after was flooded. The Exchange Road landing next door was washed away, and the people that lived there had to build a new road to get in. They were essentially landlocked. They were cut off from land by for about 3 days. The dock had some furniture blown around on it. By the looks of the Spartina hash on the dock, that the dock was overwashed by the storm. I had a level gauge in the water that measured the depth in meters. And so we can see that the storm surge from Hurricane Matthew was similar to about a 9 foot 5 inch tide, based off an understanding of the elevations of a 7 foot 7 inch tide about a week later. If you go to NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer, you can examine a piece of property like you were looking at Google Earth, and then you can artificially raise sea level in 1 foot increments up to 6 feet. And if we bring it up to 5 feet, we can see that Bohicket Creek and the Stono River begin to become connected. And many of the low-lying properties are overwashed with water. Same thing happens on parts of James Island, as you can see in the right of this image. Now remember, Hurricane Matthew was about a little over 8 feet, 9 feet in Charleston Harbor. It was about the same in Burden Creek. West Ashley, Shadow Moss area got completely flooded. And parts of that area are built in an old swampy area that was artificially filled. If we raise sea level by 5 feet, we can clearly see that happening in that Shadow Moss area and in the Orange Grove area, where there's an old river that runs through that area. In 1989, the land that we're talking about was so low that the farmers didn't farm it. They farmed the land around Burden Creek, but they didn't farm the low-lying areas. So what has the city done in the past to try to understand and plan for development on Johns Island? They've had 4 different planning exercises. The Johns Island Growth Management Plan, the Johns Island Greenways Plan, the Charleston Green Plan, and the Century 5 Plan. The Johns Island Growth Management Plan morphed into the Johns Island Community Plan, and then the Johns Island Community Plan was subsumed in the Johns Island Greenways Plan, which was referenced in the Charleston Green Plan, and all of that is codified in the Century 5 Plan, which is the comprehensive plan for the development of Charleston into the next century. I served on the Johns Island Growth Management Plan, the Johns Island Greenways Plan I was part of, and also the Charleston Green Plan. I was awarded the City of Charleston Sustainability Award in 2007 for my efforts. Let's go back to this area now on Johns Island, this low-lying area, where we can begin to see cookie-cutter developments all through the area. If we go to the Johns Island Community Plan, they talk about environmental factors such as terrain elevation being important, and that no new neighborhood should be really begun below 15 feet. And they do this in a way by saying that existing neighborhoods and roads are situated on land above 15 feet. And most of that land that lies to the northeast of River Road, and therefore adjacent to the marsh, is predominantly at an elevation below 15 feet. They also suggest that this land is appropriate for, this lowland is appropriate for a density of maybe 1 dwelling per 2 acres, or possibly lower, as we'll see in the next excerpt. Land at lower elevations will be recommended for agricultural use, longleaf pine reforestation, natural preserves, or hyper low density, 1 house per 10 acres. And they reference in particular these low-lying fingers that reach across the islands, and they are unsuitable for neighborhood development. The Greenways plan suggested that Johns Island was a special place, and it has forested lands, tree-lined roads, wetlands, and marsh views. And the Greenways plan was intended to actualize these specific goals within the community plan and the Charleston Green Plan. And it also proposed tree and site ordinance conservation ordinance. The Johns Island Community Plan, the Charleston was approved in 2007. The plan was an effort to try to protect the quality of rural life in suburban areas of Johns Island from adverse development. They suggested that we should consider elevation and habitats when making planning decisions. We should have a river protection overlay, and we should protect the tree canopy. The Lackey property, where Oakville Plantation has been proposed, was actually suggested to be a conservation area. And quite frankly, being the last undeveloped estuarine creek on Johns Island, it's a wonderful place for birds and marine life to live. Why do we care about marshes? They provide us with goods and services that we can use. They're nursery grounds, they're high productivity, they're essentially purification plants. They provide fish and shrimp and shellfish that we like to eat so much, and they protect us from storm surges. In the Charleston Harbor project in the 1990s, examining special area management plan for this area, we realized that estuarine creeks are very fragile. And when the impervious surface area of their watershed begins to change, they begin to change. At 5%, we see changes. At 10% impervious surface area, it begins to become damaging. At 30%, it's almost catastrophic. So why is the city considering 20% impervious surface nature for developments when our science, that's good local science, tells us otherwise? Stono River is a really special place. It's tidal. It doesn't have an upland water source like the Cooper. And it's classified as shellfish collecting habitat. That means it's clean. It can be impaired, though, due to fecal coliform. And it has areas that are closed sometimes because of fecal coliform. It's very sensitive to non-point source inputs, such as urban lawns and streets. So now we get to the part about trying to figure out what our request should be to the city of Charleston. And with respect to the rezoning request, here's the ecological perspective on it. Basically, the request violates all the tenets of the Johns Island Community Plan, Greenways Plan, Century 5 Plan. If built, it would put the lives and property of those people that live there at risk in a flood-prone area. Also, it's close to the airport, and airplanes do fall out of the sky once in a while. Housing density should taper down to the urban growth boundary, not increase at the edge of the boundary. The Johns Island Growth Management Plan suggested that we had that at that time when we put the plan together in 2007, and nobody ever in their right mind or other imagined that somebody would want to build one of these planned communities right next to that airport. If we build communities like this, it will lead to the degradation of this last undeveloped estuarine creek on Johns Island. And if this site becomes developed to the max like it could, all of that hardening would push runoff and floods into other communities nearby or possibly act as a dike. And that development would destroy the existing communities in the area and our sense of place of Johns Island. They say that every single dwelling unit creates about 9.7 car trips per day in a community. So 300 to 350 houses, we're talking on the order of 3,000 automobile trips a day in and out along a country road. We simply do not have the infrastructure to keep supporting that sort of development. So how do we look at this with respect to Johns Island? I think, though, there really should be no building projects below 15 feet elevation as per the Johns Island Community Plan. And right now, there should be a moratorium on building such projects until the drainage and the storm surge is understood, because every time you build a new one, it changes the path of water. We need to do this to prevent additional shadow moss type flooding situations. We don't need to have this area wiped out by some storm when in fact a little bit of planning in the past could have helped. We should honor the tenets of the Johns Island Greenways plan to create a more verdant place, to try to keep this island as this verdant wildlife sanctuary that it really is. We should try to preserve the last undeveloped estuarine creek and the other waterways. But most of all, we need to put an end to this flat earth zoning on Johns Island that is actually being destructive to the environment and the people that live here and changing our way of life on Johns Island. It's not right. This shot of Hurricane Harvey from the space station reminds us that, you know, we need to do this sooner than later. Johns Island really is a three-dimensional place, and the water is going to move wherever it's going to move. And as we build on it, and as we harden it, and as we pay no sense to this topography, we're just setting ourselves up for catastrophe. Not maybe a catastrophe, but a catastrophe because we know there will be a storm at some point that comes along and inundates this area. Thanks, and hope you enjoyed it, and hope you act on this. And if you haven't signed my petition, please do. Thank you so much for your support.